Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, we are painting up an entire Fyreslayers army, all in one go. Now, normally I like to paint different types of troops at the same time in batches, so you paint all the basic troops, then you paint the elites, and then you paint the vehicles, and so forth. But with the Fyreslayers, they all kind of look a little bit the same, and I knew if I painted one unit, I probably wasn't going to be too excited about going back in and painting 40 more. So we're just going to do it all at the same time. With this video, I'm going to show you both what I'm doing for the Fyreslayers and also try to talk a bit about why I'm doing what I'm doing and in the order that I'm doing it, so you can pick up some tips for your next big batch speed painting project. All in, this is about 23 hours of painting to get about 2,000 points worth of Age of Sigmar models done to a reasonably good standard where they aren't probably going to win a painting contest, but also look good as a cohesive, striking army on the tabletop. So, like many other speed painting videos you might have seen, we're starting off with a white spray done on top of a black primer coat. This is a great starting point for putting contrast paints and other washes on top. And there's other washes out there other than just contrast paints, which I'll show you in a minute. Because what we've got here is the Games Workshop, Citadel, Guilliman flesh for the flesh tones, and there's a lot of flesh on these models. But then, at the same time, I've got another color down on the palette, the Scale 75 Instant Color Ogre Brown. Now, as you can see here on the dwarf's beard, this is not brown at all. It's instead a little bit of a brownish yellow that I think is a fantastic trick for quickly, speedily painting blonde hair. Now, the number one thing to remember when batch painting isn't so much anything to do with paint, it's really to do with yourself, and that's don't get discouraged. When you're painting, 30, 40, 50 models at a time, every given step does take a while. When you sit down at your painting table, don't feel like you have to finish the flesh wash on every single model. Don't feel like you have to paint the metal on every single model before you get up from the table, because otherwise you're going to not want to sit down in the first place. The beauty of having all the models on their own handle is you just pick them up, you do however many you want, stop when you want to stop. I have found overall this is a much, much easier way to get whole army projects finished. I sometimes think that I'm a army painter, not a miniature painter, because really that's what I enjoy, is getting whole armies ready for the table. For this next bit, we're going to go from fast to hyperspeed, and I just know a lot of people have never painted quite this many models all at the same time, and wanted to give you a sense of kind of the motion and the rhythm that I use to get a handle on painting a whole army all at one time. You're still dealing with one miniature at a time, one paintbrush at a time, usually, but you're kind of passing the miniatures back and forth across your painting table. You can also rack them up or do some other organizational system, but if you've got the space, it's easy enough to just kind of pass the miniatures back and forth as you complete each step on each model. And then, when you're done with this step, you can pass them back and forth the other way for the next steps. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go into hyperspeed for every single step, but instead I'm going to show you the how and the why of all the different steps we're taking for the army. In general, I try to do any contrast paints before I do any non-contrast paints. Contrast paints can get a little sloppy. You're more likely, given their thin viscosity, to have them run into cracks and crevices where you don't want them. I often think it's easier just to go ahead and go in, do all the contrast paints first, using the Citadel Blue contrast paint here to put some stripes on this Fyreslayer's mohawk. And then we'll go back in after we've got a base coat of contrast down on all the areas where we want to use contrast or other thin paints like the Scale 75 Instant Colors. And then we'll block in the solid colors after that. The key to successfully speed painting a big batch of miniatures is to keep things simple. Don't get too fancy, and be aware where you can cut corners a little bit. I'm going to make the shields on the dwarves that have shields the same color blue that I'm using on the mohawk, so that I can just grab a miniature and put blue on it wherever I want there to be blue. And now, as with a lot of my videos, there'll be a point here where I'll say later, hey, stop here, you're done, you're battle ready, go play a game with this, and I'll show you all how to take it a step further. Now, one thing you can do to make some of your characters stand out a little bit more without making anything too hard on yourself is simply just pick a different accent color for some of the characters. So for this army, they're still going to have striped mohawks. They're still basically going to be painted in exactly the same speed painting techniques that I'm using for the rest of the army. I'm going to switch the stripes on their mohawks to purple. That'll make them stand out a little bit on the battlefield, make them easier to identify, both for me and my opponent. And it makes them look special, even though it doesn't actually take any longer to, at least not much longer, to swap a color out. For this next step, I'm going to give all of the contrast base coats a little boost in contrast by hitting them with a very, very light dry brush of the Pro Acryl Bright Ivory. You could use a white for this, you could use a bleach bone, any sort of light ivory color, and with all of the contrast colors that I'm planning to use in place, just hitting them with a real light dry brush of the Bright Ivory. And this can be the finishing step for these colors if you're happy with this effect. Also, you can go back in later and add another thin layer of the same colors of contrast to blend it in a little bit more. Show you a little closer up on one of these, what I'm doing here, and it's just making the texture of the mohawk pop a little bit more. It's adding a little bright pop on the fingers and on the skin. And on one hand, the Bright Ivory is a harsh highlight, but it does stand out on the table. And if your goal is to get an army that looks good on the table, there you go. Now, in every batch painting project, maybe every batch painting project I've ever done, there is a step that just feels a little bit like a slog. And for this project, this is it. These dwarves are a lot of skin. The skin is really fast and easy to paint with contrast paints, but wrapped around, intermixed, all over are little bits of metal. Now, I switched to a more careful, thinner brush for these. I'm using the Vallejo Game Color Chainmail color, and I'm just going to go over all the metal on the miniatures with a nice thin down base coat of silver. This was tedious. This was the single longest step of the process. Of the 23 hours or so that it took to complete all of these models, this was about a quarter to a third of the time. I think this was 6 or 7 hours to paint all the metal bits on all 50 miniatures. So be forewarned, this bit is a little bit of a slog, but you just do want to make sure to kind of take your time and get a thin base coat of metal on all the metal bits. On the ones that have flames, I'm just kind of painting the metal around the flames and trying to leave the flames white for now. We'll go back in and finish those up later. So grab a great audiobook, put on some podcasts, and just keep painting metal till you're done. And once you're finally done, it's time for more metal. So the copper color I found from Pro Acryl, I really, really like the color. It doesn't cover quite as well as the Vallejo Chainmail. I like the Vallejo Chainmail and the Pro Acryl white gold as base coats. But that copper there, it doesn't cover quite as well. And it was easier to just paint everything silver first. Another tip with speed painting, if everything's one color before you then add in the details, if you miss a little bit of the details, it's okay. So all the metal bits on these miniatures are now silver. I'm going to go in with this copper color and just pick out some little filigrees, some details, some shapes, some runes on the helmets, on the weapons, wherever I think it looks good. And that little bits of copper here and there will help break up the monotony of so much silver. If you're really in a rush to get the army ready for a tournament, you could skip this step, just leave it all silver. But I do think the contrast between the warm copper color and the cool silver color just adds a little more visual interest. Paint one of the 3 bracelets, whatever strikes your fancy. Once you've got all your copper highlights in place, it's time to revisit a speed painter's good friend, Nuln Oil. The Nuln Oil, we're going to hit all over the metal bits, copper and silver alike. It'll help define the shapes of the metal and separate the metal areas from the flesh areas. Using a relatively big fat brush on this, if you get just a little touch of black, running into the very edge of the flesh areas, that'll be fine. You can see on this guy, you can also use the Nuln Oil to add a little bit of shading to the lower parts of your model, darkening the legs. Hitting the legs with a coat of Nuln Oil will help draw attention to the upper part of the miniature, which is generally what you're looking for. So Nuln Oil all over all the metal bits. I've also got a pot of Agrax Earthshade here. If you want to swap it out and use Agrax Earthshade, that looks good too. If you've got any large areas of copper, the Agrax Earthshade is going to do you a little bit better and look a little bit better. But if you're just talking about putting a wash on top of a mixed metal area that's mostly silver and a little bit of copper, I would just stick with the Nuln Oil. While I'm here, and again, one of the beauties of speed paintings, I'm going to dampen the mohawk. So I've just got you can see there's really no paint on the paintbrush here. It's mostly just paint water. I'm going to dampen the mohawk and then run a little bit of Nuln Oil along the bottom edge of the mohawk and let the wetness that I put on, let that dampness just pull some of the black into the cracks of the mohawk, which will provide a little bit of shading without darkening the white areas too much. For the characters, I've pulled out another Citadel shade, the Seraphim Sepia. On the characters, I did do more copper, and the copper plus Seraphim Sepia will give you more of a golden kind of fancy effect. This is a neat trick to give the characters a little bit more differentiation by using the sepia wash on their copper bits without having added a step previously. Still the same, little puddle of copper paint that we painted all the characters with. So here's the point where this could be your final step, and that's to put some texture on the bases. The palette has already gotten messy and it's about to get even a little messier. There's lots of good basing textures out there. I like Vallejos, I like Pro Acryls. Citadels are good too. They're a lot pricier per ounce. If you're doing lots of models, something that comes in a bigger pot is nice. That's something I wish Citadel would do in the future. Now for this, you can see here, I'm just using a broom of a paintbrush. This is one of my oldest, crappiest paintbrushes. I think it came in 10 paintbrushes for $2 set at the local craft store or something. I'm just using that to smear that basing texture all over the upper flat part. It's worth going a little bit slower here if you can, not get too much of this textured stuff on the edge of the base, because it can be kind of a mess to clean it up. If you do get a little on the side, something that works well, I keep a little stack of cut up paper towels next to the painting area. Just dampen one of those and give the edge of the base a quick swipe. This particular base texture is meant to look kind of like lava or asphalt. It looks okay unpainted. I think it looks better with a quick dry brush. I'm going to fully paint it later. But if you were trying to get this done as absolutely fast as humanly possible, you could spread this texture on this top of your base, let it dry, paint the sides black, you're good to go. But I had an idea. I want to do kind of a realm of metal, rusty, metallic bases on these. I strayed a little bit away from the traditional Fyreslayer look by not including the mohawks on the lowly basic battle line dwarves, and painting their beards blonde instead of red. So I thought a cool metallic kind of realm of metal base would be cool for these. So to get that going, we're painting all of the bases with the Pro Acryl Dark Umber. Any old dark brown will do. We're going to let that dry and then go back in and add the rust and metal effects to all the bases. To get the rusty realm of metal effect on the base, we're going to combine two different paints. We've got the Vallejo Mecha Rust effects, which is you probably could make yourself by just watering down a kind of a reddish brown. It's a very thin wash. You probably could use Agrax Earthshade, maybe Seraphim Sepia for this too, but I have a bottle of this and it works pretty well. So that's the Vallejo Dark Rust Wash and any sort of bright orange you've got in your collection of paints. And with a big old fat brush, I'm going to take that and wash the entire base with the rust effect. Like I said, this probably would work with any well watered down paint. The important thing for this trick effect to work is that you get the base pretty nice and wet. You want it to be, not dripping down onto your hands, but you want it to be puddling up a bit, right? So then you get a nice thin little brush with a not watered down orange paint and just dab in some little splotches of orange. And what you're going to see is that the thick orange paint starts to dissolve into the watery dark red wash, and it really creates a naturalistic, neat rust effect where the bright orange rust is spreading out into the cracks and crevices of the base texture. I think this is a really cool effect. It's easier to see on a larger base. Let's jump over to another project here where I did for the same army. or I did the similar effect, but it's easier to see on a bigger base. So same idea, I've got some rocks glued down, I've got the same rough basing texture. I've saturated this area with the same Vallejo dark rust, and you got a big fat brush that's wet with the rust wash, and then you got a little brush that's loaded up with just the pure orange paint. And you just kind of give it a little dab, and you can see already it's starting to seep out through the cracks in the rocks. And don't be too impatient with spreading it out, because that spreading through the rocks is part of what gives you the effect you're looking for. Now let it fully dry, and here's what you end up with. This very, very cool kind of natural, unpredictable effect that I think works really well as rusty rocks. Now, to finish off the effect, what we're going to do is dry brush all of this with a very dark, kind of asphalty, raw silver color. This is the darkest silver that Pro Acryl makes. And doing this is going to break up some of the areas of orange and give it a little bit of an obsidian-y realm of metal look to the bases. You can use as little or as much if you want. It can just be the tips of the rocks. But I think that gives a cool kind of glowing embers effect. I did try to use the dirty down rust effect on these bases to see what I thought of that. Wasn't super happy with the result. I felt like the effect that you get from the dirty down rust that I reviewed in a previous video didn't work as well on the heavily textured surfaces, but I was pleased with this effect. It's a good time to touch up the edges of all the bases with some more of the dark umber, or if you're a black partisan, reach for the black, but I usually use whatever the darkest color that I used to make the base was. So go ahead and you're not going to be touching the sides of the bases if you're using handles. So go ahead and just touch those up now. And I think by finishing the base a little bit before you finish the model, it's easier to let yourself call a miniature done when the base is done. So if you always leave the base for last, I'd encourage you to try it differently next time. Finish the base halfway through the model, and you might find yourself being happy with where you've ended up a little sooner than you would otherwise. Because nothing says the model's finished like a finished base. But you can see here, this guy obviously still needs the fire on his flaming brazier done. So for the flames, right now they're a little messy. They've got a little metal on them. They're maybe not quite as bright white as you'd like them to be. So the next step is to just touch up the white on the flames a little bit, get it kind of a nice solid bright white. I'm using the Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, but any white you've got will probably be fine. Then next, we're going to use the same idea of pre-shading with pink that you might do to paint a miniature yellow and get some kind of pre-shading in. But instead of shading it, we're going to use that pink pre-coloring to create the flame effect. To do that, what you're going to do is squeeze out a little bit of a kind of a rosy pink color. This is the Pro Acryl Magenta. You get a nice little small dry brush. Get a little bit of the pink on your dry brush, and you're going to dry brush the flames with that magenta color. This is kind of the reverse of normal dry brushing. Normally you're dry brushing a lighter color onto a darker color, but as you'll see in the next step, by dry brushing some pink on the flames first, this is going to create some pre-shading that, when tinted yellow with a transparent yellow paint, will give a really cool flame effect. For whatever color flame you're doing, you want the lighter color to be on the inside of the flame. Get a little bit of pink on the metal that surrounds the flame. That's cool. As you'll see in the next step, that'll also get covered up by a little bit of transparent yellow and give you kind of a quick and easy, quick and dirty source lighting effect on your miniature. Let's take a closer look at another one. You can see it just real light dry brush of the pink. Do try to avoid getting it on the model. You're just hitting the raised areas of the flame with that pink color. Once you've pinked up all your flames, you want to put on a transparent yellow on top of everything. I'm using the Pro Acryl transparent yellow. I think it's easier to get it on in a single thin, smooth, even coat. The contrast paint tends to puddle a little bit more than the Pro Acryl transparents, but either one would work. If you're using the contrast, just kind of make sure you're putting on a thin coat, not all over, because you want to get the gradients between the pink and the white that you've got. You want to have that evenly covered by the yellow. I just think this is such a neat trick. It's fun to do when you're painting yellow miniatures. I think it's even more fun and dramatic to do when you're painting flames. And it's almost an optical illusion as it happens. Your brain still kind of registers the pink as pink until it's fully covered by the yellow, and then it's like a switch is flipped and it looks yellow and orange now. I think that's super cool. If you have the yellow spill over a little bit onto the metal, that looks cool too, as if a little bit of the yellow light is being cast onto the metal. So just go around all the flame areas, real thin coat. I'm using a short, bristled, kind of soft brush to get into all the cracks and crevices. If you leave a little bit of white in the very deepest cracks, that's okay. It actually can even look good. And I may even later go back in and add just a tiny touch of pure white into the deepest cracks. So just all over again, kind of avoid getting on the miniature, but if you get a little bit on, it's a little yellow glow on their shoulder, no big deal. So with the exception of the invocations and the magma droth for this army that I'm going to paint separately, I'm doing it all at the same time. So that means the characters, they get their flames painted now too. I've done all the flames the same way. The characters in the Fyreslayers army all have some flames of some sort coming out of staffs or axes or runes or whatever. I thought this miniature was cool because it's got two. Look at that side-by-side difference of what it looks like before and after. You can see the before on the right and the after on the left. Just really neat effect. I've left all the lizardy dragon skin on the characters plain for now. It's going to get a coat of some sort of contrast paint, but I kind of want to get a feel for what the army's going to look like and what color is going to complement the other yellows and oranges. Maybe a turquoise. Wasn't 100% sure yet at this stage, and I also knew I wanted it to match the magma droth. And you're doing a project like this, you don't have to have every single detail mapped out before you get started. Alright, so here's the totally could call it done phase, but I'm going to futz around with it a little bit more. What I'm going to do is put on another thin coat of the Citadel Contrast Guilliman flesh just to darken the highlights on the skin a bit. Got a fresh shade of palette paper underneath me because the previous sheet of palette paper had just gotten a little too gunked up, and by selectively applying a little bit more contrast paints onto some of the areas other than the very, very tippy tops of the muscles, you get a nice effect. Just kind of blend it all in, tone down those highlights just a little. But again, 100%, you could call the project done right now. Before you go, hit like, subscribe, all that good stuff, but you can also stick around and see some next steps on these miniatures. So in this step, what I'm doing is taking a little bit of bright blue, like a lightning blue, and any sort of lighter, brighter blue. I'm just tracing that over the dry brushed highlights on the blue stripes of the crest. By putting the bright blue on top of the white highlights, it's going to make it that much brighter. The lighter the paint that you're painting over, the brighter the paint is going to be, so that this bright blue looks even brighter for going over those highlights. And it just kind of pulls the mohawk together that much more. The next very small detail is a quick dab of Carroburg Crimson shade paint on all of their noses to give them a little ruddy tinge on their nose. Give a little more character to their face. After that, I'm going to grab some of the Inkensity white. I really like this as a very opaque but very, very thin white. It's like a white ink. It acts similar to white ink. I prefer it to the white artist inks. I think it just flows a little better. It's a little more opaque and is more water stable after it dries. So with that and just a nice very thin brush, you're just going to lay a little bit of this ink into the deepest cracks and crevices of the flames to give them a bright white hot appearance. Again, totally skip this step if you want, but I think it adds a nice little highlight to the flames. With flames, you always again want the deepest part of the flames to be the brightest, and this Intensity white achieves that really nicely. You can keep an eye out for part 2 of this project. I'm painting up the magmic invocations, which are basically big spells made of fire, using this exact same effect, but on a much larger scale. So the Fyreslayers all have these metal runes hammered into their skin. What I'm going to do to pick those out and to give it a little bit of a grim effect on the runes is just paint a really thin line of the Citadel Contrast Vulpus Pink all around the edge of the runes. The edge of each rune has a little lip of raised flesh, kind of a little ridge of raised flesh where that magic metal iron was hammered into the skin, and a little thin layer of Vulpus Pink makes that raised edge of skin look like scar tissue, which I think is a neat effect. You just have to decide how much time and detail you want to put onto these, but you can see those runes on the back. I think that's an hour or two well spent to highlight each of those runes with scar tissue. This next step is really up to you, depending on how grim and dark you want your miniatures, but by mixing up a little bit of a transparent black, you could use contrast with contrast medium. I really like the Pro Acryl transparent black these days. Vallejo's black glaze is also good. Just mix up by putting a little bit of transparent black in the deepest cracks and crevices. You can darken the shadows and then take a clean but damp brush and just feather them out a little bit. Underside of the weapons, anywhere that might be in shadow, by adding a kind of painting on some shadows now, you can get the grimmer, darker look to your figures. Just any place that looks a little brighter than maybe it should be. The speed painting that we did earlier has some nice highlights, has some nice shadows, but it doesn't necessarily give you the focus shadows that you might want in the darkest parts of the miniature. If I was better with an airbrush or a rattle can and got the initial white spray over the black primer, maybe you could skip this step. But I find I usually want to add in some darker shadows, behind the skirts, under the weapons, places like that. If you're up for it, you can try wielding two brushes like chopsticks. That really makes it faster to be putting on a little bit of black with one brush and then being able to quickly swap for a damp brush in your other hand to feather it out. One of the things that's great about the Pro Acryl transparent black is how easy it is to feather out. It just seems to kind of want to spread out easily without going all over the place. Now, between the Nuln Oil and the Agrax Earthshade, their little leather loincloth skirt things might look, reasonably well shaded. Maybe you can leave them as is, but I wanted to go back in and darken them up, give them a little bit more of a leathery look, and for that I'm using the Intensity Brown, which I think is a nice, warm, leathery color. Just hitting any parts of their clothes, if you can see those air quotes there, that they're wearing, and belts and loincloths and stuff like that. Now, most of the dwarves that are wearing helmets, their eyes are shaded enough that I don't think it really makes sense to try to paint the eyes. You'd hardly notice them, and it doesn't really matter. But on a few of the unhelmeted miniatures and on the characters, I do want to paint the eyes. So for that, I'm using a 5-0 liner brush. You notice how long the bristles are? That really helps to just paint a little white line, just very, very small, just like I did on my thumb there. Basically just like a little white hyphen inside the eye socket. Just kind of like so. So then with your white lines painted in the eye sockets, you're just going to put a tiny little dot of black in the middle of each eye, and you're good to go. The area that you put the white on should already have been shaded, so if the little black dot goes a little bit up and down, that's fine. You're basically looking for a white horizontal hyphen and then a little tiny black dot or a black line in the middle of the eye. If you feel like your white hyphen was a little bit wide, you can take that same very thin liner brush and just draw a very thin black line above and or below the white of the eye to thin, like I'm doing here, just to thin out the whites of the eyes and make them a little angrier looking. When you're speed painting an entire army, it's still nice to make a little special effort on the characters, even if you're not spending all that much extra time on them. So for the characters' dragon skin cloaks, I decided on a quick coat of Pterodon turquoise. It's I think it's one of the standouts in the Citadel contrast range. The highlights nice and bright, the darks get nice and dark. So a quick coat straight out of the pot of the Pterodon turquoise on the characters' cloaks will make them easier to identify on the tabletop, and I think that kind of jade green complements both the yellows and oranges of the fire and looks good with the blues and the purples on the mohawks of all the characters and the line troops. On a textured surface like this, you can just go back in and lay in a little more of the same contrast paint into the cracks, and the texture that's there will help that just settle right in and darken up the shadows. Once the cloaks are dry, you can go back in with just a little bit of paint on your brush, a little bit of a bright ivory or a white paint, and just pick out the very top raised areas to give those scales a little bit of a shimmer. That just accentuates the shape of the cloak, of adding just a little slight highlight to a couple of those. increases the contrast. And, even though you're adding a white, not a green, makes the green, to my eye, look a little brighter. You can take that as far as you want. On this more kind of scaly, bumpy cloak, I'm taking it even more kind of extreme highlights and putting a layer of bright white on the top flat edge of all of the scales. And then once this is dry, we'll hit it with a thin down layer of the same contrast paint to blend it all together. So now with the white highlights dry, to finish off the cloak, what I've got here is a mix of about 50-50 contrast medium and the same turquoise contrast paint. I'm just putting a thin layer of that all over the cloak. This is tinting those bright white highlights the same green as the rest and just kind of pulling it all together so that the highlights aren't quite so stark, but you're still maintaining a really nice difference between the brightest parts of the model and the darkest parts of the model. You can adjust how much contrast medium, season to taste. If you want the highlights to be a little darker, add less of the clear medium. I do recommend the contrast medium. It really is a solid choice for this. Pro Acryl's new wash medium is also good if you want to mail order that or if your local store stocks it. But using just water will make it harder to get the tint of the color to stay on the highlights, and it's going to want to run into the cracks of the model, which is not what you're going for here. All right, cloak's looking good, but to give it a little bit more visual interest and make it so that the cloak isn't entirely monochromatic, I'm just gonna go in with a very light touch and add a little bit of purple to the shadows. Adding another different color to the shadows of any given thing, whether or not it's a cloak or skin or whatever, can be a nice way just to add a little bit more visual interest. If you look at a lot of acrylic paintings and art in the army books and stuff, you'll see that often the shadows have some other hint of a color added to them. It's not just a monochromatic green on green on green, for example. So a little bit of purple in the folds of the cloak, just a light layer. This is the Citadel shade purple, so it's very transparent. I think that looks cool. You could use any sort of a dark, cool color, I think. Purples work well for shadows, dark blues work well for shadows. Depending on the miniature, you might get away with a dark green or blue, red. But purples and blues are my go-tos. Whenever you're trying to speed paint a project, it's good to look for opportunities to use the color that you have open in front of you. So I pulled out this purple to add a little bit of shading to the cloak, but while I've got it open and while I've got the character in my hand, I'm also going to then use the same purple shade to darken up the shadows on the hairy purple parts of his mohawk. And that is the final step. After that, you might want to go through model by model and just touch up any edges of the bases that got a little nicked up in the process. If you see any mistakes on the models, go ahead and fix those up now. And that is it. You have got yourself an army after about 24 hours of painting. Well, thanks for joining me all through this video. We do have one last step, which is to pop all these angry little dwarves off of the handles. I've actually used a few different ways to attach them here, both to show you some options, and it's because what I happen to have on hand. Blue tack is a quick and easy way to attach the models to the handles. You also can use a double-sided adhesive tape. This is the black adhesive tape from 3M. It works pretty well. It's a nice strong hold. You can actually use it to then stick a magnet to the bottom of the base after you're done if you want, or you can just kind of peel it off like so. It's pretty quick and easy. It doesn't stick that hard to the plastic and isn't that hard to pull back off again. A little more trouble to remove than the blue tack, but also a little bit more secure hold, and you can reuse it if you kind of take it off as a cohesive enough piece. The last option, which is the strongest hold that I've found, but also the finickiest to take off, is to hot glue the miniature to the base. I've never broken a base with this. I've never had any issue with it. It is a very, very secure hold, which is nice for larger models or metal models. With a little blob of hot glue, you can then just take a pair of clippers and nip that off there. And if there's a little bit of hot glue residue on the bottom, no big deal. So there you go, 3 different ways that I use to attach miniatures to the upcoming Jolly Lark painting handles. Keep an eye out on Kickstarter for those. We'll have a big announcement when those are ready to go live. And as always, thank you so much for joining me on this Jolly Lark today. It's always fun to make these videos. There's been a lot of great comments on the other videos. If this prompts you to paint up an army in the next couple of weeks, let me know. I'd love to see the results. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. Always happy to answer questions down there. And yeah, just have a great time painting. I'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.